Oh man, this is one of many games from the golden age of local multiplayer on the GameCube. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was the action RPG that marked the return of Square to Nintendo's home consoles. Crystal Chronicles garnered a lot of hype and attention leading up to its release, and I even remember seeing a trailer for the game in a movie theater, which I don't remember being very common back in the day. The game received a lot of coverage in Nintendo Power, and my circle of friends was extremely hyped for its launch. It was a clear departure from the core Final Fantasy RPG series, but the game's cutting-edge visuals and multiplayer offerings were way too good to pass up on a console that desperately needed third-party support. This is something you'll likely hear me say quite a bit throughout the video, but let me just say it once now. Crystal Chronicles is a game that absolutely must be played with friends. It's a decent single-player adventure, but to play it alone would be completely robbing yourself of the true experience this game has to offer. This here is some of the greatest local multiplayer of its console generation. There is one glaring issue, however, that likely barred many gamers out there from ever playing Crystal Chronicles the way it was meant to be played. You needed 4 Game Boy Advances and 4 link cables to play with 4 people. GameCube controllers weren't supported whatsoever. Admittedly, GBA implementation wasn't all that bad, it did some good things for the game. Your inventory, your map, and other player-specific information were all confined to your GBA screen. Was it worth the price point and the hassle of someone's batteries always dying? I'm not so sure, but we made do back in the day. Crystal Chronicles is such an appropriate name for this game. Playing it extensively with friends will undoubtedly create memories, laughs, and great times. It does such a marvelous job of instilling the sense of adventure. You begin the game in your hometown, but you quickly learn the world is faced with a crisis. A vile poisonous smog called miasma has covered the planet, and the only way to repel the evil force is to collect myrrh, a purifying liquid that can be obtained from myrrh trees scattered throughout the world. This liquid imbues each town's sacred crystal with a protective force that lasts only about 1 year. A year in the game passes with every 3 successful stage completions. The game requires you and your companions to travel the world, looking for the source of miasma while also protecting your village from being poisoned. The story is handled wonderfully and is lightly expanded upon as you progress, which is great for a multiplayer-focused experience. The story is told in bits and pieces and never really gets in the way and doesn't really get too fleshed out until the very end. You and your friends, playing the roles of the brave heroes wanting to protect the village, carry a chalice filled with myrrh that creates a purifying circle around your party. This was sometimes a point of contention within our many caravans over the years. Someone in your party was tasked with holding the chalice and effectively leading the party through the game's many levels. This created many opportunities for the chalice carrier to troll your party by pulling the chalice away from everybody. Sometimes no one wanted to carry it, sometimes it became pure anarchy, with everyone grabbing the chalice whenever they pleased. But more often than not, it was a duty that we delegated and rotated around. Some game critics might have found the chalice system to be irritating, but honestly, I really enjoyed it. Certain fights became much more challenging as you were surrounded on all sides with little space to move. This little bubble was the only thing between your party and the evil that you were trying to vanquish, so I really liked the chalice from a thematic standpoint too. Let's take a step back to the beginning of the game. Crystal Chronicles allows you to choose your character's name, race, gender, look, and family profession. I really like the game's playable races, and they feel like they fit within some sort of Final Fantasy IX universe. Your attack stat, your magic stat, and your defensive technique are all determined by your race. Clavets and Selkies are a bit more balanced, whereas Lil T strongly favor physical damage, and Ukes favor magic. We typically chose a balanced team with varied professions so that we had an easier time accessing some of the game's strongest weapons near the end of the game. There are 2 ways you could approach multiplayer. You could either start all characters on the same memory card, which is the most efficient way, or you could bring your friend's character over from their memory card to yours. Sadly, none of their items could come over or leave with them. However, artifacts and equipment could be transferred both ways, which is ultimately the most important part of your character. You traverse the overworld with your caravan, traveling to each stage in the hunt for myrrh. The stages in Crystal Chronicles were flat out gorgeous for their time in 2003. The game itself just has this incredible artistic vision that has aged pleasantly considering the time period. It is worth noting that the frame rate drops during certain encounters will require you to adapt your timing accordingly. The game's music as a whole is just marvelous. You'll remember many of the game's songs long after you put the controller down. Each stage was littered with enemies to battle and loot to obtain. Speaking of loot, we utilized an honor system for most of our drops, but we often delegated one person to carry Guild, the game's currency. We'd then split up the gold as we visited towns to purchase new armor and weapons to keep it fair. Monsters would drop food, crafting materials, and magicite, this game's version of magic. Magicite is temporary, only lasting the duration of the stage that you found it in. Fire, Ice, Thunder, Cure, Clear, and Life are the primary magic spells. However, with proper timing, you and your friends could combine your spells for some pretty awesome effects. 2 fires put together with a quicker timing would result in Fyra, a stronger version of fire. Putting them together with a longer but more precise timing resulted in Firaga, a fiery explosion that covered the whole screen. This logic also applies to Ice and Thunder. The fun doesn't stop there though, you could also fuse these spells together with focus attacks, which is done by holding the A button for a strong charged attack. You can even use Magicite to concoct spells like Haste, Slow, Gravity, and Holy. I love the magic system in this game. It feels incredibly rewarding to successfully fuse spells with your party. Certain enemies had spell weaknesses too. It is worth noting though that spell fusion is entirely different when playing alone, and is handled within the menus of the game rather than having to time your cast with a friend. This makes magic way less exciting in the single player experience. As I stated before, spells vanish after completing a stage, and this may have frustrated some people. At the very least, while you do possess Magicite within the stage, it has infinite use. But for me personally, the only time we ever experienced difficulty because of the game system involved the Cure and Life spells. As the game progressed, the challenge ramps up significantly. As such, finding Cure Magicite early on in the level is extremely important. This would often force the party to burn through food resources really quickly if Cure never dropped. If the game decided to be unkind with Life Magicite, the same challenge presented itself. The game does drop Phoenix Downs to revive fallen party members, but depending on how coordinated your party is, you may not always have access to very many. It rarely happens, but sometimes you're dealt a bad hand and one or two members of the party are forced to follow along as ghosts because life never happened to drop. This is rarely ever an issue, but when it is, I almost kind of appreciate it in a way. It forces you to play incredibly carefully, using your item slots and your inventory items as efficiently as possible. As for physical attacks, each character has a standard melee combo consisting of 3 hits. It isn't really a button input you can just spam, however. There is a specific timing to consistently pulling off your melee swings properly. As I mentioned before, your character has a focus attack. The power of the attack and even how it looks is dependent on your character's weapon. Weapon upgrades are a big deal for character progression in this game, and some of the game's latter weapons are difficult to obtain, so when you finally do get that shiny big weapon, there's some sense of fulfillment. If your caravan is anything like ours was though, there may be some disagreement about who gets to craft item upgrades first. As you battle your way through each stage, you'll also encounter puzzles. Later in the game, these puzzles become a little more complicated, but for the most part they're simple and a nice touch. Once you've reached the end of a stage, you'll be confronted with a gigantic boss fight. They start off simple and easy enough, but oh my goodness do these fights become intense as the game progresses. They will push you and your friends to the limit. The boss will cast debuffs constantly, summon adds to smack your friend that's in the back trying to heal everyone, and most of their attacks pack a heavy punch. You may not think much of the bosses at first, but the difficulty ramps up, I promise. Boss fights will have you scrolling through your command list, which is done using the L and R buttons. You'll swiftly switch between attack, defend, cure, life, phoenix downs, and food items as needed. There is a great sense of accomplishment when you topple some of the game's harder boss fights. Each time you enter a stage, your character will be tasked with an objective to complete. If you're playing with a group of friends, you'll A, definitely want to complete the objective, and B, hope to God that your objective is an easy one. The easy ones range from do physical damage to pick up gil. However, there are some difficult ones that are incredibly hard to obtain a high score with. Every time you see defeat enemies with spell fusion, you might as well throw in the towel unless one of your friends is really willing to cooperate with you. These objectives ultimately create competition between you and your friends. Your score at the end of each stage determines the pecking order for choosing artifacts, which give you a permanent stat upgrade. Did that awesome +3 artifact drop for your little T? Well, one of your friends that scored higher than you, likely because they got an easier objective, can take it away from you if they really want to. I really like the idea behind the score system, but I wish it was a tad bit more balanced. If you're playing with a nice group of friends, however, there shouldn't be too much trouble. You can use some of the more rare crafting materials like mithril, orichalcum, weapon scrolls, armor scrolls, and ancient potions to barter with your friends when choosing for artifacts. Once in a blue moon, an incredibly rare ring artifact can drop. Rings are among the most useful artifacts and are essentially magicite that you permanently unlock for your character. These rings only have a chance of dropping if you meet certain scoring criteria, but even then it's strictly chance. Specific ring types are only found in certain stages, so if you want that epic cure ring, you're gonna have to run the same stage multiple times to get it to drop. This brings me to my next point, revisiting stages. After you conquer a stage, you'll collect a drop of myrrh from a myrrh tree and you'll be on your way. The tree will be sapped of energy for a fixed period of time, but it eventually charges. There is a large selection of stages, but there is a big focus on the passage of time and revisiting each stage. When a myrrh tree becomes replenished, you'll want to revisit the stage. With most games, I'd typically be pretty critical of forcing players to revisit stages over and over again, but this game pulls it off so well that I can't produce a single legitimate complaint. When you revisit stages, the challenge is there in spades. Stronger monsters infest each stage and they will quite literally annihilate your party if you walk in all willy-nilly. Smartly aggroing enemies becomes essential during these revisits. Stronger enemies take longer to defeat, deal significantly more damage, and will sometimes stun you with their melee attacks. The stages themselves change a bit too, and may require you to navigate differently than you did during your first visit. And then there's the upgraded bosses. As I said before, bosses later in the game will test the coordination of you and your friends. The game's tougher bosses will provide an excellent challenge. I cannot reiterate enough that this game is meant to be played with friends. The experience is entirely different when played alone and is honestly inferior in every way. The challenges that the game poses to you as a party make them feel completely different. Multiplayer forces you to coordinate in battle, properly position the chalice, compete for high scores, smartly allocate your resources, among other things. When playing alone, a Moogle will help carry the chalice for you, and as I previously stated, the Magicite system is way less exciting when you're playing by yourself. Enemy encounters are so much more intense when you and your friends are faced with adversity, shouting out what you're planning to do next. Is everyone in the party dangerously low? Coordinate with your friend from across the stage to cast a giant Kiraga on everybody. Do you have 2 magic users in your party? Time your casts well enough and you'll be rewarded with an explosive Fireaga, a crackling Thundaga, or a bitter cold Blizzaga. Has your healer suddenly fallen in combat? Someone in your party will have to stop what they're doing to cast Life or a Phoenix down. What if your healer was the only person with Life and Cure Magicite? The game requires you to adapt on a whim sometimes, and coordinating with your friends can give you such a rush. Coordination is the theme of the game here. It can be a pain navigating the game's beautiful towns when you and your friends aren't all on the same page. The chalice disappears when you enter a town because they're all free of miasma. This often resulted in all of my friends arguing over which way to go, and we'd get nowhere fast. We also had a lot of arguments about whether or not we should play the silly caravan racing game. So many of the game's silly quirks like these are missing when you choose to play alone. And sadly, this is likely how many people had to play the game when it came out in 2003. Either you had 4 GBAs and 4 link cables, or you didn't. Although you could play with 2 and 3 people as well, but I'm just using 4 because 4 is obviously the most fun. Sadly though, you pretty much had to rely on your friends to own these things. This brings me to my next point. Playing Crystal Chronicles today is no easy task. Even if you own all of the accessories needed to play the game optimally, you still have to contend with dying batteries. This is the kind of game that would benefit so greatly from an HD port. The GBA features were actually pretty nice at the time, but now that televisions can output higher resolutions, it might be possible to condense the features of the GBA screen into the game itself. I'm not sure if there really is demand for an HD port of this game, however. I'd be absolutely enthralled, but the game has become something of a cult classic over the years. It was a spin-off title on a console that didn't sell extremely well, and many people that did play it didn't get the full experience. Despite all this, I can't think of a game deserving of an HD port more than this one. And yes, I know there have been sequels, and Crystal Chronicles became its own series of spin-off titles, but none of these games captured the spirit of the original. I really disapprove of the direction they took the series in, but that's a whole different story for another day. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles has so much heart. It's a game we've revisited numerous times over the years. It's so exciting to create a new caravan, hearing that amazing introduction music as you begin another adventure. It's a game that creates memories with the scenarios and challenges that it presents you, and it just feels like this game was built with the multiplayer experience in mind. It would be so nice to revisit this game someday with a group of friends without having to bust out the old GameCube and batteries. I have to say it though, there's something just so special about local multiplayer. Playing games online is great and everything, but nothing quite beats the experience of playing games with a group of old friends around the same TV. I just hope that someday more people have the opportunity to play this underrated gem. Thank you so much for watching the Super Retro Review.